So what I want to talk about today is fairness with respect to how people use language. And it all has to do with the things that we assume to be true of people based on the way that they speak. So I'm going to start off by going over a couple of examples of linguistic variation in the way that people use language. And then I will go over or introduce some ideas or some ways in which people actually discriminate based on this type of variation. Then I'll share some ideas of how we can confront this kind of discrimination. So I don't think it's any kind of surprise to anyone that we all speak differently. It's one of the most fascinating things that people in my field study. From a global context, it's observable in the great many number of languages that are spoken around the world. That I'm sure many of you could name maybe a couple of dozen of these, but in fact there's many thousands of them that differ from each other, not just in terms of the words that they use, but the sounds that they use to construct these words, their ways of arranging these words into sentences, and their ways of organizing the world and describing the world into different categories. Linguistic diversity in the United States is a snapshot of this, between the hundreds of languages that have always been spoken here and the hundreds more that have been brought to the United States by migrating populations. There's another dimension of linguistic diversity that I'm sure many of you are also familiar with, and that's just in the way that we all speak English. It's always been a source of wonder to me. So even as an adolescent, I was curious about why a young Canadian like myself would say words like out and about, where many other people would say out and about. And as I looked into this more, as I pursued this type of knowledge, the more I found out things like how a New Yorker would say "pak the ka," or how a Bostonian would say "pak the ka," or how someone from the South might pronounce words like quiz and dress, or how a Californian would rhyme skull with full. Here at UCSB, I've spent some time conducting some research into what linguists have called the California shift. This is essentially an observable change in progress that's been happening over the past 3 or 4 decades or so that amounts to a new dimension in accent variation in the United States. Accents differ from each other in part just by their vowels. People pronounce vowels differently. Acoustically, we can measure vowels along a couple of different dimensions that roughly we can call height and backness. The words I've got up here on this chart show how high or how back their vowels are when these words are pronounced. Accents differ from each other because the same category of vowel might be relatively higher or lower, or relatively more or less back in different accents. In the California shift, a series of vowels is incrementally lower and farther back than it is in other American varieties. This one's right here. Now, it doesn't by itself mean anything. It has nothing to do with the moderate weather that we all enjoy. It has nothing to do with the relaxed attitude of people who live here. It's simply an example of how language can change over time. Language can vary in ways beyond pronunciation, so it can vary in words as well. So you might call something a freeway that someone else might call something, the same thing, an expressway. You might call it a potato bug or a roly-poly. You might call it a fountain or a bubbler. You might say that it's hella cold or that it's wicked cold. Grammar can vary too. So where I'm from, it's actually possible to say, I'm done my breakfast, or I'm done my homework. In other places, you can say, this house needs painted. Or you can say, these thank you notes need written. Everything I've given you so far is an example of regional variation, saying the same idea but with different pronunciations or with different words. Variation can also happen along different dimensions beyond space. It can happen along dimensions of age, or gender, or ethnicity. When you think of all the ways in which two people who speak the same language can nevertheless differ from each other, it's kind of a wonder that they can understand each other at all. And if you're curious about how this can happen, on the one hand, variation can happen simply because the link between sound and meaning is really, really flexible and really, really changeable. But people can still understand each other because we're equipped to unpack the information that we exchange with each other using a multitude of different cues. In another way, variation can happen because we tend to speak more like people who are like ourselves. It marks us as aligned in some way or other. And when linguistic change happens, it tends to happen within groups before it happens across groups. As I acknowledge that, don't let the lesson be something like it's impossible to understand somebody who speaks differently from you. It's not like that. And yet, people still tend to overestimate the extent of the effects of variation. Even something as subtle as the types of regional differences that I've shown you so far get picked up and blown out of proportion by writers who don't really understand the implications of this kind of research. And they make claims like these are completely different languages that people speak. You also see it in headlines and book titles that make claims like men and women speak different languages. Now, men and women may have ways that we can detect where they do speak differently or tend to have different speech habits. But the thing is, there's a lot of things that people assume to be true of, or assume to be gendered about speech that aren't really as gendered as people believe they are. So for example, and you might have been told this, you might have been led to believe this, or you might have been led to believe otherwise, I should say, that women don't really say like more often than men do. But there might be a common belief that they really do. Another notable example that's gained a lot of press recently is so-called vocal fry. Now, this is an actual linguistic behavior that we all do. It's found in a lot of languages around the world. Essentially, it's a gesture that involves a slower rate of vibration in the larynx. The vocal cords vibrate more slowly during vocal fry than they would during the pronunciation of vowels in other contexts. It tends to happen when we drop our pitch and at lower volume, so it ends up occurring towards the ends of sentences, and it ends up carrying also this function of ending a sentence, indicating an end in the turn of conversation. I usually have trouble replicating it on stage under pressure, but I'll try and do it if I just said a word kind of slowly like that. And then you can maybe hear a little bit of that creaky voice. Now, for some reason, in the popular mindset, vocal fry has taken root as a behavior that only young women do, and only for frivolous reasons. Young women aren't the only people who do this. And when they do it for the same reasons that anyone else would, for reasons like ending one's turn in conversation. So this shows us the downside of variation. There doesn't need to be a downside, but there is a downside, and that is that people use variation against each other. So even something as innocent as something like the California shift that I showed you a couple of minutes ago can turn into or serve as fodder for really coarse, exaggerated caricatures. Right? So it turns out there's this fairly prevalent ideology out there that adherence only to a fairly restricted set of expectations and standards is what's acceptable. And any divergence from that set of standards is not simply different, but also wrong. And that's not an ideology that I intend to support with what I'm talking about today. I want to address and confront that type of ideology. This ideology nevertheless misunderstands the sources and consequences of variation. It can do things like consider divergence from those standards as reasons to have a low opinion of someone, to have a low evaluation of someone, grounds for derogation or discrimination or a low assessment or just poor judgment. And this standard can include expectations of knowledge of pedantic details, like knowing when to say less versus when to say fewer. But it can also include expectations of not sounding female, or not sounding young, or not sounding black, or not sounding Latino, or working class, or even regional. These aspects of identity that show up in people's speech can end up serving as a hindrance then to someone who's trying to succeed in their education, trying to start or advance their career, trying to secure a loan, or trying to find a home, which is a really, really unfair thing for that person to go through. And what's worse, sometimes there's particular linguistic behaviors that end up being assumed to be true only of one population, even though they're not. So I've elected to start calling this particular type of behavior linguistic gaslighting, borrowing the term from clinical relational psychology. In that context, gaslighting refers to a scenario in which an individual is led to believe that they are responsible for the abuses that they suffer from and experience. By analogy, linguistic gaslighting is similar. It's the pegging of a linguistic behavior falsely on one group and criticizing them for it. And it's a terribly unfair practice, of course, as well. So, an example of this would be, suppose someone considers a linguistic behavior like vocal fry to be simply wrong. So someone who has that opinion about vocal fry, but faults only women for it, is essentially showing an unconscious bias just towards women, faulting them simply for being women. Linguistic gaslighting shows us the implicit biases that people sometimes hold towards other groups. It's even more insidious, of course, when the gaslighting is embedded within advice literature or the guise of help for people to try to figure out what they can do to change their speech to make it more acceptable to others. So you might think the solution then is to discourage variation, to encourage people all to converge on the same set of standards. If everyone spoke the same way, the reasoning goes, then there will be no reason to discriminate against people based on the way that they speak. Now, the fact that sometimes people are criticized for the behavior that other people get a pass for suggests it's not even an option. And it's not at all what I would call reaching through variation, as I talk about it today. Trying to get rid of variation with the interest of helping someone avoid being judged still validates the ideology of judgment. It still says or assumes that the problem is the person who diverges from that set of standards. If you don't think this is a problem, consider who it is amongst us who has to do the least amount of work in order to converge on these expectations of standards. And some of us are able to diverge from standards without real consequence, and others of us are not. And if you still don't think it's a problem, consider the ways in which a lot of our social roles are constructed. Consider children and the way that we raise them, for example. Many of us raise little boys to wear blue and to play with trucks and to participate in competitive games. And we raise little girls to wear pink and to play with dolls and to participate in more collaborative games. There's no one out there telling us that we have to do this. So it's not something that's conscious on our minds, but it's really systemic and it's pervasive. And so as a result, it shouldn't be a surprise that little boys and little girls end up forming different play groups. And along the way, they probably develop some different linguistic habits as well. So isn't it really unfair then to the little girls when they reach adolescence and adulthood for us to criticize the way that they speak because of these habits that they've developed in these different circumstances? Isn't it unfair for us to expect them to drop their girl talk if they want to hold some kind of position of authority, even though their female perspective is an invaluable asset? So men and women indeed might be shown to have some gendered linguistic behavior. We don't need to be judgmental about it. The actual differences aren't necessarily the same as the differences that we believe to be there. So perhaps we can let those things be. But think now about the speech of Black Americans. The history of Black speech is very tightly linked to the history of its speakers. Going back to a period in history where entire communities were uprooted and enslaved and moved to a different continent against their will, forced to learn a different language against their will. Emancipation did not mean the end of inequality, nor did the civil rights movement or the end of segregation. The odds are still stacked against African Americans because of a modern society that still more subtly maintains the fences that things like slavery and segregation once held up much more forcefully. In those types of circumstances, of course, linguistic variation is going to continue to diverge and to grow. And it's asking a whole lot of members of such communities to try to adapt their speech and converge with some kind of standard, which actually marks the speech of groups of people who historically have oppressed them. And there's linguistic gaslighting that happens with African Americans as well. There are linguistic behaviors that we assume, or people tend to assume, are very typically African American in nature. Things like, I don't know, saying walkin' instead of walking, or saying respect instead of respect. These are behaviors that lots of different people do, but for some reason, only African Americans are held accountable for this and criticized for it. So to sum up so far, variation exists. There are ways in which you can find different groups of people speaking differently. Those differences are not as vast as what sometimes people believe them to be. They certainly don't need to be a reason to discriminate against each other. People still do it though. So what can we do about it? Essentially, I've already said that getting rid of variation is not the solution. It's not viable. Even if it were, it would still put all of the onus to change on the gaslit populations. All the work would be up to them to converge with these idealized expectations of standards. And even if they did converge, there's no guarantee that they would see the benefit of such convergence. So instead, there's a different kind of reach that we can all make. We can simply let variation be. We can treat variation along dimensions of ethnicity or gender or age with the same basic innocent wonder and curiosity that one might hold toward regionalism or little details like the California shift. We need to reject linguistic discrimination. We need to recognize linguistic gaslighting for what it is. So how do we do this more concretely? A couple of different ideas come to mind. This first one might be the hardest to think about, but we need to rethink standards. And I'm not going to say something like we need to do away with standards or drop standards or pretend that they don't exist, but we need to consider their role with a little bit more nuance. You might have been able to detect so far in what I've been talking about that I'm very much in favor of diversity and very much in favor of variation. So I like these things just for the sake of curiosity. And I don't like to call linguistic behaviors wrong. This won't be a surprise to any of you who've gone through any amount of training in linguistics. It might be a surprise to the rest of you, but one thing that we're able to determine is that every variety of language follows some sort of internal set of conventions and rules. And it's really harmful and unfair to deny that regularity in the speech of the non-standard speaker. So instead of simply asserting that standards are the only true correct way of using language, we can teach them as useful tools of communication, of interaction, and writing. To put it more plainly, assessments of standard usage shouldn't really be used to test anything except knowledge of standard constructions. Another approach outside the educational context has to do with letting go of this self-proclaimed helpful but judgy type of perspective. This might be difficult for you to do if you're still a student in a class right now whose instructor expects you to follow some arbitrary edict like don't use the passive voice in your writing. It might be hard to do if you are interviewing for a job where your potential employer expects you to change your speech habits or your speaking style. But one day, and I hope this is really soon, you will reach the other side of the desk. And that is when you get to make the call. When you get there, don't be the teacher who repeats arbitrary rules that actually contradict convention. Don't be the writer who writes another piece telling women what they need to do to be taken seriously in the workplace. Don't be the employer who hires people under the expectation that they're to hide aspects of their identity, including the way that they speak. That's the kind of reach that we can all make. Because despite all these differences that we can see through linguistic variation, these differences don't build walls between us. And it's not hard at all for each of us to reach through that variation and hear what each of us has to say and contribute. Thank you.